Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
And also by the planning party, which is happening on October the 30th of 2020, if you're listening in real time. This is happening with Amanda McKinney and I, and we are going to walk you through how we do our end of year planning each and every year. We share the entire process so that you can repeat this in your own business every year or every quarter if you want to. Amanda and I get really excited about this because we see the difference it has made in our businesses. It's like having a map or having a compass or having a plan of where you want to go. It makes all of your business decisions so clear and easy. To register or find out more, look under trainings and events on theconnectedyogateacher.com. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow, a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, and a trainer and consultant who works for yoga teachers. And this podcast was created for you so that you can connect to the information and inspiration every single week and feel supported as you navigate these sometimes very tricky jungles of not only being a yoga teacher, but also being a business owner / entrepreneur. Part of my goal, my why for creating the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast and also our Facebook group is to have a place where we as yoga teachers, our community, can hold space for some difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. In today's episode, we're revisiting a topic that we've recently covered, cultural appropriation and racism, but from a very different angle. In episode 184, I spoke with Dr. Shala Vaidya about whether yoga is cultural appropriation. And in episode 173 with Chara Carruthers and Maria Kirsten, we talked about racism and politics and social justice and how this plays out in our yoga classes. We also have a bonus episode with Michelle Johnson discussing anti-racism and yoga. All of the links for these are in our show notes if you would like to go back and have a listen. In today's episode, I invited Jesal Parikh to give us more insights on why movement science is racist. And I get it, connected yoga teachers, if that statement alone makes you feel uncomfortable. It's so interesting because when I first just got on the call with Jesal, I said something along the lines of, your movement science might be racist. And she corrected me and said, actually, the name of the workshop was, your movement science is racist. And so I knew right then this is one of those conversations that does bring some discomfort to me. I feel like a couple of things are happening. One, I don't know enough about it, and that's why we invited Jesal on to talk to us about it today. And 2, I'm a privileged white person, so these kinds of conversations do bring up some discomfort. So I just want to address that, acknowledge it, and let you know that I'm right there with you if it's feeling uncomfortable. And this is the really interesting thing. It might make us uncomfortable to hear this, but I think it's such an important conversation to have, to learn from, and to really examine and to ask questions. Is what I'm learning from one perspective? We dug into so many interesting things. I can't wait until you have a listen to this. I got thinking about so many of my students as Jesal and I were talking, and also just the impact that this has had, not only in our yoga spaces, but how we buy clothing, how we look at any kind of movement or fitness or health or wellness. This is the place to hang out if you are in for a discussion around inclusivity, equity, and representation in our yoga and wellness spaces. Jesal is someone who has experienced her fair share of racism and discrimination in our very own yoga industry. If you are listening on the go and you think, oh my gosh, I want to jot that down or go back to that topic or look up that link, not to worry. We get the show notes for you, and they're at theconnectedyogateacher.com/189 for this podcast. Also on our show notes page, you can leave us a review. Doris did this. Doris from PEI says, a must for all yoga and mindful movement professionals to learn, grow, and also connect with others. very inspiring and informative tips and engaging guests. Thank you for sharing all the expertise to help the rest of us grow, up-level, and rise. Thank you so much, Doris, for leaving this review. I am super excited that you said this and that this review just coincided with today's episode. I think the wording is amazing. We can grow, up-level, and rise together as an entire community of yoga teachers when we keep digging in, asking questions, and questioning where our training comes from, where the science comes from. I'm really excited about this. Another thank you that I have is for Schedulicity, our sponsor. Let's hear our hot tip of the week from the team over at Schedulicity.
Hello, Connected Yoga teachers. This is Ren from Schedulicity with the hot tip of the week. Schedulicity features easy-to-use integration with social media. You can add our scheduling widget to your Facebook business page in 2 easy steps. This allows people to book with you and sign up for your class directly from that page. We also have marketing tools to allow you to spread the word to your social media accounts. With just a few clicks, you can set up a call to action inviting your Facebook friends and followers to visit your Schedulicity marketplace listing. Check it out and let Schedulicity help you stay as connected with your students online as you are in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Team Schedulicity. Each and every morning, I get excited to open my Schedulicity app and take a look at my calendar and see what's happening in the day. Alrighty, Connected Yoga teachers, let's dive in and meet Jesal. Jesal Parikh is a yoga teacher, movement educator, podcaster, author, and disruptor working on creative solutions for equity in yoga. She has years of training in areas like anatomy, biomechanics, meditation, prenatal yoga, social justice, and more. And she provides individual and group yoga as well as movement education and mentorship throughout her personal brand, Yogawalla NYC. As an Indian American yoga teacher who has experienced racism and discrimination in the yoga industry, Jesal strives to disrupt the current oppressive systems in yoga to make way for new paradigms and for diverse leadership in the industry. This is actually how I found Jesal. She co-hosts the Yoga is Dead podcast, where she leads critical conversations about issues of power, privilege, race, cultural appropriation, and capitalism in the yoga and wellness worlds. If you love today's conversation that we have and you think, you know what, I want to dig in more, I want to find out more, go have a listen to the Yoga is Dead podcast. Jesal's mission is to uplift those of us who are feeling isolated and marginalized by the yoga industry by working to elevate oppressed voices, spark deeper conversations, and propel individual and collective change. I'm so excited that you are here for this interview, that you are showing up, and you're ready to dig in. Let's meet Jesal. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Jesal. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Shannon.
I am really excited that we get to chat today because I attended a workshop that you hosted and you had a lot of other people there as guest speakers. I feel like you organized it all. And it was all about how our movement science is racist. Do you want to tell me, before we get into that, what is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
So I do a lot of work spread across different platforms. So for myself, I am a yoga teacher and I've started getting into more speaking and like advocating in different ways. So coming up with creative solutions to disrupt the yoga space around the issues of race, equity, appropriation, movement, like all the things I talk about on my podcast, which is Yoga is Dead. So I obviously do work through the channel of Yoga is Dead. Same thing. We have the podcast and then we are doing workshops, events, talks, speaking series, things like that over there. And then I just started formalizing a platform with a couple of people, a collective of people called Yoga Teachers of Color. And so that started from this list that we had put out, the first list in 2019 of 19 women of color to watch in yoga. in 2019. And then we had done 20 yoga teachers of color to watch in 2020. And so now we're working on turning that into a full-blown platform and space and collective for yoga teachers of color to come together to amplify our representation within the industry and to sort of just make a claim that, hey, we are here. Like, you may not think that we're here, but we are. So we need to pay attention to us too.
This is so good. I remember seeing that article come out, and quite honestly, like looking just out across at a teacher training or online summit or at the, a magazine that'll come out for a yoga teacher conference, a lot of the time what we do see is like white women, bendy white, thin women in the yoga space. And so it's so great to see you doing this work. Is there something that made you just go, all right, that's it? Like before you started the Yoga is Dead podcast, is there something that was like so frustrating that made you decide to do this?
The podcast or the list or both? Are you speaking about?
Both.
Okay. I mean, it's a culmination of being in the yoga industry. I joined the yoga industry in 2010, right? And just from the outset, like I did my first teacher training in India, and the moment I stepped back onto North America, my certificate was treated as invalid because it was not Yoga Alliance certified. And this is because the place that I got my certificate was at the time the only yoga university in India. So imagine the only yoga university in India, like, got an official university status from the country itself, which yoga comes from and is codified and developed. And you come back to the US with a certificate from there and they're like, nope, sorry, they didn't pay us these white people their fee, so your certificate counts for nothing. And so for me to just want to even do a 300 hour as like the next level of like, which by the way, my certificate was already 300 hours. It didn't already fit. It was already more than what was has been set out as guidelines for the US. And so to come back and want to do the next level, that was difficult for me. Like I called so many teacher training programs to say like, hey, I did this in India. It's from a university in India. I'd love to join the next step, because the one thing I felt was a little bit missing from that training was asana based learning. Not that we didn't have asana, but it wasn't obsessed with asana the way we are here in the West. And so I wanted to sort of like be in that conversation. And yeah, it was like a nightmare for me to get into a program. And there was one program that let me in. That was it. And then that one program had to issue me a 200-hour certificate from their program in order for me to register the 300.
Wow. I find that fascinating. And that would be extremely frustrating to say, hey, I went the extra step here, took an extra 100 hours, and I'd even have to went back to like where yoga originated, took it from a university, and it still isn't recognized?
Right.
Okay.
That was like the very first step, right, of me trying to become a yoga teacher. And then it only got worse from there, sadly, that, at every turn, I felt like there was something, just frankly whack going on in this industry. I don't know how else to put it, but like to the point that, by the time I got married through this process of like after I became a yoga teacher and a few years after I became a yoga teacher. And like my husband, who works in finance, would turn to me often and be like, what is going on with the yoga industry? Coming from someone who works in finance that doesn't have the greatest reputation, like the industry.
Right.
So like, he's like, your industry is so much worse than mine. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It's nuts.
Do you have any insight into why that might be?
I strongly believe it's because we are a very unaccountable, we have no accountability in this industry. That's
right.
Why. In that, like, we're all small businesses with like no HR departments, no like regulations, no guide. Like the Yoga Alliance issues these guidelines. They really are meaningless. They're not following up on any of these guidelines. And we have no other form of accountability, right? And we're talking about people who then are making low wages. Like, yeah, we might be making minimum wage. And if you really count up the amount of hours we work, we're probably making well below what minimum wage as a whole in this industry. And so when you talk about that being the base of this industry, people who are making probably below minimum wage for the most part, there's a huge power differential. And so what are we going to do? Like get together and sue these bigger businesses? Like most people don't have the money to even like hire a lawyer to sue. So, yeah, I think those are the reasons, we get easily taken advantage of because of this power difference.
I hope, like I'm usually a glass half full kind of person, although this year is testing that. I am hoping that we're seeing some change in this. And your workshop that you did your movement science is racist, which I just want to call out. When I went to like confirm the name with you, I said, was it called Your Movement Science Might Be Racist? And you were like, no. Really nicely, it is racist. And I love this differentiation of like, or this, this small change of words that I put with it makes us really take a look at it. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate that about your podcast as well. I love to listen to those episodes because they make me uncomfortable. They make me think, they make me re-examine. And there are many uncomfortable emotions that come up, like a defensiveness of yoga, all kinds of things. And layer upon layer, I bet if I go back and listen again, they're probably even more so. I'd pick up new things that I was ready to hear. So I really appreciate that you're digging into the work that I bet sometimes makes you get some hate mail.
Of course. I mean, absolutely. We get so much hate mail. We get so many people trying to argue with us and convince us and just flat out hating on us. And yeah, we just have we have like a label in our inbox that we just have like a DNR, do not read, do not resuscitate. Like this chain, and we just archive it. Like,
oh my gosh, I love that so much. I got a really nasty message the other day. I shared something that was political and on my personal Instagram, and I got a really nasty message, and my kids were like, Mom, that's when you've made it. I was like, oh, right.
I agree. And I mean, that's 100% true. If we weren't saying something important, no one would care.
Right.
People would just be like, oh yeah, that's been said 100,000 times. Like, why should I care about what you have to say? And that's the truth. Like, we rub people the wrong way because we're bringing a perspective that has not had airtime in this industry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. So this workshop was a great example of, I was just showing up, and moment after moment, I was like, oh, there's that. Oh, there's this. So what were some of the threads that were talked about that really stuck out for you then in this workshop that you led?
There was a lot because it was very dense, I have to say. And each speaker obviously brought their perspective and their background and experience to the conversation. And so I learned as much as I probably talked or gave information, probably more. It was probably disproportionate, to be honest. But I'll say, like, from the beginning, one of the things I wanted to explore, like in the beginning phase of this conversation, was very on a base level, just kind of questioning the data that we are working with. Because oftentimes we like to assume in the science realm that the data itself is somehow objective, but it's not. And so we need to start questioning that, because not only is the data not objective in terms of methodology, because bias is also brought into how studies are conducted, and we need to recognize that, especially when these studies are being created and reviewed by like primarily white people, like where that bias doesn't get questioned. It's also biased then in who's included as part of these studies. So if we look at the population, like, even in fitness, we have to like acknowledge, and I worked in market research for a long time in healthcare market research. So I can say this with some insider knowledge that, like, when it comes to the medical realm, a lot of times the numbers are low in terms of statistical significance to begin with for like how many people are in the study.
Right.
And so, right, like that in and of itself is an issue. Okay. And amongst that small population of people being included for the study, they're almost always white. So we have to be very careful that when we get these standards and rules that come from this medical world and this research world, that we're not applying it in a blanket way to everybody that we come across, because it does not necessarily mean that just because this thing was standardized and codified that it applies to everybody equally.
Is there a study that stands out that really you can think of as an example for this?
I was just listening to a podcast and somebody talked about BMI actually. And I thought that was great because if you look at the history of BMI, like the people that were studied for BMI were white cisgendered men.
Right.
Right. And so now we're taking this standardization and we're applying it to everybody and saying your BMI needs to be exactly within this narrow range, not really taking into account the diversity, not only across like genetics, but environment and like all of those other factors, right?
Yeah.
So that's a huge, huge one. And like we have proof, we know to some degree that, like, for example, when it comes specifically to fitness, we know that some genetic traits are going to make you better for some specific types of activities.
Yes.
Right. Like, and I think there was a study of, I hope I'm not wrong on this, but there was a study done. I think it was among Kenyans because they they typically win a lot of marathons.
Yes.
Right. And it was like a study done among Kenyans, like why Kenyans might be better runners. And it like has to do somewhat with like how their leg shape like has developed genetically and how their lung capacity has developed genetically because of the climate as a result of like an arid climate and things like that. So there's like actual factors, like epigenetic factors that make them better runners than other folks, right? Running marathons. Right. So like we have to remember like this diversity exists. Now imagine then the same person, right? Like they immigrated to the US and they're playing a different sport, and how maybe they are training for that sport and their fitness instructor might be telling them advice for like the whole population, not really understanding that like their strengths might be in a certain place and not in another place. And like another example of that is like we know like that people are born with a certain amount of like fast twitch versus slow twitch muscle fibers, right? And like, yes, you can change it. Yes, you can develop it. But I'm sure if we understood that better, there'd be like some upper limit as to how much an individual is able to change that about themselves. Right. And so if you're like wanting to run, but you don't have the muscle fibers to like support you being the best runner, right? Like maybe there's something that needs to like there needs to be different information around that, or education around like you can continue to run, but like you're never going to be the best runner. You're probably better off doing this other thing.
Right. This is so good. So that when we are taking a look at studies, we start to ask the questions like how many people were involved in this study? What was their fitness level like? What was their diversity like? All kinds of questions that we could ask looking at a study. And it's so interesting to me. I'd love to listen to podcasts where people break down studies, specifically with pelvic health. And I love when the interviewer asks, like, you know, what was their fitness level? And the person's like, actually, we're not sure. Like that's important information. And we can't think, oh, well, this scientific study came out, and so this is across the board. You know, there are a lot of questions. We have to be critical thinkers and see who was doing the study, you know, who was in the study.
Exactly.
Their bias. Yeah.
Right. Their biases. And like, we know for a fact that like the amount of fitness studies are like low to begin with anyway. It's not like we have like robust information. Mm-hmm. And so to then extrapolate that this is somehow like set in stone, unbiased information that should never change and again should apply to everybody equally, it's just insanity. It just like does not compute for me.
Right. Was there also something about anatomy wise? Did I see you post a quiz of like an anatomy question?
There was one, it was about the fibula. I posted like a little, I don't even remember what it was. It was like basically about the fibula, how there is this little bone called the fibula that shows up in oftentimes Asian populations in the back of the knee. And it can cause knee pain when squatting, but it's like similar to the patella in that the tension of that, the bone, it's like a sesamoid bone, is supposed to help with certain movement, right? And so just thinking about that, right, it kind of blew my mind to think about, okay, if you are a person of Asian origin and you're in a fitness class and somebody's telling you to squat and you're complaining of knee pain, what's the first thing that person's going to tell you? And likely what they'll tell you, right? Like just based on experience, likely the first thing they'll tell you is, oh, your hamstrings aren't strong enough.
Right.
You have weakness. It could be tendonitis, but likely if you haven't been doing a lot of this yet, it's weakness. That's what's causing the pain, as opposed to not maybe knowing that there's a bone there that could be causing that pain.
Right.
Right.
And so our anatomy books are probably made primarily by white people examining a white body.
Right. Absolutely.
That's bizarre to me. I have so many questions now. I think, why is that bone there? Is it going away? And this makes total sense if we look at the evolution of many species. Obviously, there was that whole thing that came out, was it this year or last year, about like looking at our necks, and if we're looking down at our phones all the time, are we developing in a different way with our posture? That's
Absolutely.
another. Yeah.
And like you think about, for the torsion of the femoral head, I can't speak, I'm sorry. When it comes to that torsion, right? Like we have no idea if this is like specific to specific populations, like if there is more torsion in specific populations or not. And so if we're not looking at that information, I think the better route would just be to assume that we don't know anything about the individual in front of us, rather than saying like, hey, this one alignment is the perfect alignment for everything. Right. It's in yoga, right? That's true in yoga. It's also true in fitness. And during the panel discussion, Maestro Dr. Shante Cofield said, people squat different. That was their one big exclamation that I was like, yes, people squat different.
Yes.
And so why should we assume that toes need to be forward, knees need to be forward, hips need to be back a certain amount? Like, we don't know. How about we try it and talk to the person in front of us and ask them, like, what's going on for you?
Oh, this is so good. The interesting thing when you're saying that is a yoga teacher was just asking me last week, how can I make sure that my students are safe in their postures when I'm teaching through Zoom, which a lot of us are doing right now? And I think this ties into that. If we let go of like, this way to move is unsafe, like really, if we start to ask, what is actually unsafe? Because we're taught many things in a yoga teacher training that I think are okay movements. It's been repeated over and over again through our teachers. And so we need to ask, like, is this person in pain? Do they enjoy that movement? Instead of making all bodies try to kind of be this cookie cutter.
1,000%. And I'll add to that is like, then when we get to this level of being in the fitness environment, we add our biases around what we think the person's goals are without really knowing, right? So like oftentimes we see people, like I see teachers teaching and they're making the assumption that everybody is there to get a strong, sweaty workout, that everybody is there to gain muscle mass or lose weight, that everybody has the same ideal of what that weight might look like, that body shape might look like, right? Like these are just some baseline superficial assumptions, not to mention if we were to like dig deeper, I'm sure we're coming up with more biases around what we think people are coming to us for, as opposed to really honoring what they need and want.
I love this. So we're also not saying, like, just to clarify for the listeners, it sounds like to me, and let me just ask you if this is correct, that we're looking at the individual right in front of us. It's not like we're saying, oh, because you're Asian, then I'll cue you like this. And because we're looking at each person,
absolutely.
Not making any assumptions of like, we don't have x-ray vision. We don't know what's going on with their anatomy.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, what I'm saying is if we had more information, we could probably make better guesstimates, but they're still guesstimates.
Yeah.
And we still, like you said, need to have a conversation with the people in front of us. And we still need to ask for feedback, even as teachers, like consistently ask for feedback, right? That's one thing that I see as an industry as a whole, we're not doing. We just assume like we have our class plan and we walk in and we're like, we're doing this. It does not matter what the circumstances are.
Right.
And that is not the right approach. right? The right approach could be like, let's get to know the people, like, let's create some humanity here. Like, let's get to know what are the goals, what are the lifestyles happening. Like, not everybody's going to have the same lifestyle. And then maybe find some common ground amongst the people in the room, right? Like, if you're a mom, your goals may be just that you want to be able to pick up your children without pain.
Right. Or just
That
like
could be your
go
goal.
somewhere
That's
where
it.
everybody's not clinging off of you for an hour.
Right. Or just, right. And maybe you have somebody who's like a marathon runner, and we might assume that, oh, they're here to like get stronger, but maybe their goal is just to take a break from the marathon running, like, because they need something that balances out that intense energy.
Yes.
Right. And so, like, what are the common ground things we can do? And I think actually, if we were to look at those common ground things, we'd bring more of the other limbs of yoga into the practice.
Oh, that's so nice. Oh, I love this. If we were to look at what we can find as common ground in there, then we could bring in some of the other limbs. I love this. That thought is really nice.
Yeah.
So what were some of the other things that really stuck out for you in this workshop?
Well, we talked about like how the spaces are curated, and also how I'm going to call it the product, because like, you know, all the factors that go into making yoga a product, for example. So it could be like the teacher and how they curate the class. It could be the environment. It could be the culture of the place, that, you know, that location. All of these things like kind of make up that product, and how that is all curated has a lot to do with who feels welcome and who doesn't. And so, you know, I'm going to quote another one of my colleagues here, Kendra Copeland, who talks about how it's very different to say all are welcome versus this was made for you, with you in mind, right? Whereas like most things in fitness and in yoga, like the target audience is white folks. That is the target audience. That's who's in mind when people are creating these products. When they're creating the classes, they decide who to hire, what time slots to put them in, what the environment is, who's going to be centered. Like, if somebody comes in wearing a shirt that makes a person of color uncomfortable, and the person of color speaks up, who's going to get the benefit of the doubt in that conversation, right? That has to do with culture. Who's going to be told, oh, you're making a big deal of nothing, or everybody's allowed to express themselves how they want. Like, so, you know, a lot of the panelists talked about that level of safety, and that level of like, not necessarily, we had talked about it in CrossFit, because it's a video I had seen, and somebody in the panel knew, like, I had seen this talk posted on their story, so they knew what I was talking about. And I think it was Alexa, and it was basically in CrossFit, somebody was asked, like, why don't Black people do CrossFit? And it's not that Black people don't do CrossFit. It's that, are they going to throw down $300 a month to go to a gym next to a guy and like work out next to a guy wearing like a Trump shirt or a MAGA hat? Like, probably not.
Right. So I know our yoga teacher listeners often will say, everyone is welcome. I want to create a safe space. I want to make sure everyone feels invited. And even more so now, like in 2020, I feel like I'm hearing more yoga teachers like, how can I make sure that my website gives this message that everyone is welcome? How can I look at making sure so I don't think the intention is there on the surface, but what makes that happen? Correct me, or like help me out here. I think it's this like deep-seated white supremacy that we have going on, and automatically people might be really upset thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not a white supremacist, but like in our entire culture. And I know our yoga teachers want really quick answers, like, okay, well, I don't want to be doing that. Point me to what I should be doing. Like, where's the checklist of how to make my space be a safe one for everyone?
Again, I'm going to quote Kendra Copeland, who was on a different panel that I did, and she says, how can you make yourself a safe person to be around? That's the first step. You got to make yourself a safe person. And that means doing the work and understanding where your biases are, and understanding where you are probably unintentionally upholding white supremacy, right? And white supremacy being the notion that white people are at the top of this power hierarchy and that everybody else, Black people are at the bottom, right? And everybody else is in the middle. But white people are at the top and they deserve to be at the top. And that's the like unconscious belief, subconscious, I don't know, probably subconscious belief, right? Subconscious belief that we all hold, that it's not just white people that hold this subconscious belief, because we are all conditioned to believe this. And so it's a lot of unconditioning, unlearning that has to happen around this idea.
Right.
Again, like who is being centered in the place that you're practicing or teaching? And then I'll say, like, again, going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, the conference, who you see in conferences and who you see in events. This is why part of why I created this panel, right? Who are deemed experts? Who gets to be readily seen as an expert? And I'll say, like, you know, oftentimes, yes, I'm talking about appropriation right now a lot, like in my work. But oftentimes I know that people see me as the person who talks about appropriation as opposed to a holistic person. Like I am a yoga teacher. I'm into movement science. I like talk about narcissistic abuse. There are all these elements to me, but people want to see me in this little box. And I'm not saying it's about me. I'm saying that's the tendency. We tend to see people of color as like, oh, you're here to talk about diversity.
Right.
Right. As opposed to like, hey, maybe this person who talks about diversity is like the best yoga therapist that needs to be uplifted as a yoga therapist.
Yeah.
Right. And so like that level of expertise.
I want to pull a couple of things out here. One is if our yoga teachers want to dig a little bit further in this, we did an episode with Michelle Johnson on yoga and anti-racism, and she talks about this white supremacy a little bit more. And she has a book. You can do the work. And I love how you said, as an individual, try and become a safe person to be around. That's a key piece. And it's not a quick fix. It's not like done it, check. Like I posted something on Instagram and I read that book. It's a continuous work. And to keep asking, like, why is it that I'm doing this? And the other thing you said is look at who is centered. I think it's the responsibility also, knowing that most of our listeners are white women, because that's the yoga population that I see right now in our Facebook group, in our listeners. And this idea of who is centered, ask the questions before you go to a yoga teacher training and before you sign up as a guest speaker. You know, how many people of color are on your panel? How many... there's a better way to ask this, I feel like, and you would know this, because I don't want to just say people of color. I also want to be looking at, you know, our trans and queer yoga teachers are like all shapes, colors, like, what is the word I'm looking for?
I mean, what I would call underestimated or marginalized populations. Like
marginalized, thank you.
Right, yeah. So it would be, you're exactly right. Like we need to make like a societal pact that anybody that gets asked to do these things starts to ask these very important questions and commit to projects only when like certain requirements are met. Meaning like a panel should be somewhat reflective of the population. Like there was a Toronto yoga conference in your area, right?
Yes.
I don't think it happened because of COVID, but when it was set to happen, and the headliner, I'm going to name names here. The headliner was Sean Korn, who put out a book about like living your truth or something like that. And I'm like, okay, Sean Korn, off the mat into the world, living your truth, headlining an event where there's not one teacher of color. Tell me Sean Korn doesn't have the power as the headliner of that event to say, excuse me, but I can only commit to this if there are more people of color or more diversity in terms of like all of the marginalized and underestimated groups represented here.
Yeah. I was part of a conference a while ago. It was an online conference, and it got called out for having mostly all white people or all white people. And at first I was like, whoa. Like I just have to call out. I was like, well, I worked really hard to get there.
Yeah.
I'm like cringing at myself of admitting this. And I was like, how was I supposed to know? Well, I was supposed to ask, But I didn't even know to ask then. And now I know. So if people are listening to this podcast, now you know. It's important to ask. Yeah.
It's important to ask. And one of the things I'm very slowly working on as I'm overwhelmed with things to do, but one of the things I'm slowly working on is a collaboration. And I don't want to name people just yet. When it's finished, it'll come out and we'll name everybody who's a part of it. But it's a collaboration on understanding like how to navigate being asked to be a part of an event. Like, what are the questions you need to ask?
Oh, I'm so glad you're doing this because we have a mastermind and we were talking about an online summit and then someone said, I emailed them and said, are there people of color there? And then they said, yes, there are. There's so many people of color. And then I was like, well, what's the percentage? What should it be? Like, and there's this whole, like, is there a mathematical equation? Can I ask more questions? I love that you're going to provide this. It's so good.
Absolutely, because that's the thing. And like with regards to that Toronto festival, right? We can say how much of Toronto is racialized, right? If the festival is happening in Toronto, it at least has to be reflective of Toronto.
Well, as far as I know, and I could be wrong with statistics, but as far as I know, white people are the minority in Toronto. I could be wrong on this.
I believe that's, I don't have the stats, but I've heard Rebecca Price talk about it. And I know it is a minority. I don't know the exact percentage, but I do know it, like most of Toronto is racialized, like the majority of Toronto. So to have an all white conference, that takes some work to make that all white, right?
It does. It does. I have to say that I just started looking at it when everything kind of hit with Toronto and I was scheduled to be there. Now, my concern was much more about COVID. I don't want to say I wasn't concerned, but I was just like, I'm not going because now there's a virus that I'm not going to be part of spreading. And I feel like I've asked myself a few times, what would I have done then if COVID hadn't hit?
Mm-hmm.
How willing am I to like make a stand, put myself out there in a way that is going to upset a lot of people, and also take away opportunities for myself? And I think that's something that we have to keep asking ourselves as white people. I have to keep asking myself that. We as yoga teachers need to keep asking ourselves the same thing.
And I want to reframe that a little bit, because when you say taking away opportunities, there's already an opportunity disparity. Let's acknowledge that disparity, right? Meaning people of color are not getting those opportunities anyway. And so like what you're doing is sharing the wealth, right?
Yes.
It's not that you're going to become poor by doing this. It's that you're going to start to spread out some of that power and some of that wealth to other people who historically have been oppressed, and that wealth and those resources have been kept away from. That's what's happening.
I'm so glad that you addressed this, because that's how it feels as, I want to say, like, as people, we're usually pretty selfish and self-centered as much as we work on being better people as yoga teachers. And so I love that you address this, that if we feel like, oh gosh, this, I had this big opportunity, I worked so hard to get here, I just want to be quiet and I just want to do my thing and share my offerings. And in that moment, we could take a look at what I want to say is, like, the timeline of white supremacy is insane to me. Of like, not just white supremacy, but like when women could vote, when we didn't have slaves anymore, like looking at the timeline of humans and how
and not only is it like hard to fathom and hard to really comprehend and digest, it also, I mean, we're talking about yoga, this yoga space specifically, right? And let's just be clear. I want to be very crystal clear on this. We're talking about people, white people, right? When you're talking about like white people not wanting to give up the opportunities, yes, you worked hard, but just remember, you are still profiting off of somebody else's culture. And not to bring it back around to cultural appropriation, but it has to be said, right? Like that at the end of this, it's still a culture that has been historically oppressed by white people, a people that have been historically oppressed by white people, and then you're being treated differently because of your whiteness, right? Like you get to be seen as an expert, you get to be seen as cool, you get to be seen as avant-garde, you get to be seen as like all these positive things, versus when Indian people or South Asian people do yoga, we're often seen as provincial, we're often seen as not assimilating, we're often seen as not experts. So like there is a double standard in how when we do the same thing, we are seen differently. And yet again, the profit potential for white folks is exponential versus being a person of color or being South Asian.
I hope that's switching. I was thinking the other day, like for my friends who are like marketing coaches and who coach yoga teachers and do that consultant work like I do, I just hope they are helping our BIPOC population to really see this as an opportunity right now to really you're doing that work as well to create that platform, which actually makes it really easy for people who are looking for yoga teachers to get on their guest panels, to get on their podcasts. So This is good. We're at a place of where we can really embrace the change and be part of it. I want to speak to something that I hear yoga teachers say. They'll say, yoga is for everyone. Yoga is about union. Where does race or politics or any of this stuff, why is it even coming in? I just want to keep my yoga space zen, and I don't know if you'd add anything else to that you hear.
All those things, love and light to begin with. Positive. Somebody's called out recently and they kept saying like, oh, I'm happy to have the conversation in a positive manner. I'm like, positive by whose standards?
Yeah. Well, that's when it's really important that we start to look at definitions like tone policing, which right. I get. Like, I feel like we all do this to some extent. So it comes back to...
It's a defensive reaction for sure. It's a defensive reaction. But like, again, let's come back to positive, for example, because I think it's a good one, right? When we talk about a positive, constructive conversation, we need to be talking about who is it positive and constructive for. Because if a person of color comes to you and says like, what you're doing is harming me, and you're saying, well, this conversation isn't positive. What you're saying is it's not positive for you. But what would make the experience positive for, like, let's say I was coming to you, Shannon, right? This is in this scenario. What would make the conversation positive for me would be if you acknowledged the harm, took responsibility, and decided to take actions that rectified the harm, right? That would be a positive conversation for me. But what you're saying is your positivity doesn't matter. It's only my positivity that matters.
Right. This is so good. If we took this out of the context of yoga teachers for a moment, and let's say I was a teacher in a classroom and there was a child in there and I'm just being like verbally mean to them, and then they come to complain and I say, oh, let's keep it positive. Whereas that's the exact thing.
You were the person, like not you, but in the scenario, right? Like
yes.
you would have been the person that created the harm. And so then to turn around and say you can only talk positively, that again is like a hypocrisy because you created the harm. So if you wanted to keep things positive, why create the harm in the first place?
And then I know what defensive that white fragility shows up as. It's like, well, I didn't create the harm. My ancestors did, or someone else did. And I just have to, now I'm getting blamed. Is there anything that you say to that?
That is in and of itself true. And you are still upholding that system that your ancestors created. You're still participating in that system that your ancestors created, because I'm not upholding that. I'm not trying not to, right? I have to be in it not by choice, but because it exists, right? So if your ancestors did this, but you are participating in upholding it, it's your responsibility to dismantle it because you have the power. I don't have the power. if I had the power, I would have dismantled it long ago.
This is good. And this is where we as yoga teachers can do this. We can bring our union in and all of the teachings of yoga and say, we're going to do this together. We are going to like really take a big look, do that inner work and figure out how we can do this in a way that will switch things. Was there anything else in the workshop that you thought, oh gosh, if yoga teachers knew this?
Yes. And I want to bring it back. I want to kind of bring appropriation and movement science into like one cohesive like thought. And that is that when we bring science into yoga, we often then like to think that it's something new and that yoga no longer like either matters or is valuable or serves in some way. And like we'll often bring in like a little piece of science and rebrand it and be like, oh, look at us, we're so amazing. And that is so harmful. That is so harmful. And it's I can give you so many examples, but the one we talked about on the panel happened to be FRC. And I did the FRC training, the seminar, the like 1-day seminar. And it was real. I want to state that it was a valuable seminar. I'm glad I attended. I learned a lot. And
what is FRC? Sorry.
Oh, functional range conditioning.
Okay, perfect.
And it was a lot of yoga teachers are doing it because there's a lot of synergy, because quite frankly, there is a lot of yoga in that system, unacknowledged, right? And so this person, the person who created it, Dr. Andrea Spina, his whole thing is that you go in and he talks crap about every single movement modality that is not FRC. Like that's his thing. You go in there, he's going to talk crap about CrossFit. He's going to talk crap about Pilates, this, that, and the PTs even. So it's not that he was singling yoga out, and I want to make sure that context is stated. However, he does then go on to talk about yoga and how it's like whatever, how he thinks it's inferior and not as great as his system. And yet you look behind him on the screen and part of his system is like cat and cow, right? Part of his system is like laying down at the end to calm down the nervous system. Hello, Shavasana.
Right.
It's like there's all these elements of yoga brought into this movement modality, and then it's like deemed inferior because this little bit of science has been brought in. And that he's definitely not the only one doing that. And I've seen it with like so many different we see rebranded yoga all the time, like animal flow. Animal flow is great. Again, I'm not knocking animal flow, but like animal flow is not called yoga, even though it's very heavily based in yoga.
Right.
I often hear, and I love Pilates. I just want to be really clear that I'm not saying these are bad things. Like Pilates is another one where I often hear people talk about it divorced from yoga. Like as if Joseph Pilates did not study yoga. Joseph Pilates did study yoga. And so we kind of like have to acknowledge that there's a timeline, right? Like a lot of what we love as movement science people, like could not have existed without the existence of yoga. It's just an evolution of time and information.
In that evolution, what do you think we owe to yoga in terms of, because I've heard some teachers say like, no, this is what yoga is. And we stick, like, I realize this is an entire podcast episode, but like we only stick to these things. I mean, I was trained in the Kundalini tradition first. So it was like, you teach these things, otherwise you will reincarnate as a cockroach, like for many years, or the other side where like, let's flow with it. Let's add this thing in from PT and this thing in from wherever.
Where am I at with that?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a bad thing to want to take elements of yoga and create something different, maybe move away from how it has been traditionally practiced. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that then it is moving away from the template given to us by the ancestors, right? Of this being how yoga is practiced in this particular way. Like it's not part of any lineage. It's a new-ish thing. But there needs to be a deep acknowledgement that yoga is a big part of what inspired this, right? And it could be yoga inspired, but I think there needs to be that acknowledgement. And more so, not just because of like that it came from yoga, but because of the historical oppression of the people who developed and codified yoga and who risked their lives to keep yoga alive for us, right? Like yoga was banned under the British Raj. So that like to practice yoga was you were putting your life at risk.
Yeah.
And people still kept it alive despite the fear of death. And so we need to acknowledge that when we callously like move forward and say like, oh, look at this new brand I created. Right?
Right.
Like,
and when we like rebrand it, don't even call it yoga and don't even give any credit to that or.
Yeah, that's absurd, right? Like I know like I'll give you an example of someone I think who is trying to do it really well. And Catherine Bruni Young, I think, is trying to do it really well, right? She calls her brand Mindful Strength. The word mindful is in there. It's like kind of a nod. And she does not shy away from talking about yoga and talking to yoga teachers and acknowledging that there is a strong yoga component. And yet, is it truly yoga? I mean, who's to say? But there is an acknowledgement, at least, right? That this, whatever she's doing is inspired by yoga.
Yes. Oh, this is a good question. Is it truly yoga? And I would say, well, it really depends who's showing up and how they're doing it.
Yeah,
well as the teacher.
That's a whole deep conversation. I mean, I have my strong thoughts around that whole conversation. So.
Oh, that's good. This is so good. Who knew we were going to touch on so many topics here? So one thing I remembered actually from the workshop, and I don't remember it completely, it was Dr. Rima, I think, who talked about it, because I jotted her name down and I'm actually going to have her come and talk with our pelvic health professionals group. And it was about folic acid and how it's not for everyone. It's based on what white women need or white people who are pregnant need, but it's not across all races. I don't know if you remember that exact.
I remember the example because I take folic acid and I was like, do I need to take methylfolate? Like that was the question that popped into my head, but I am not a doctor, so I can't speak to why. She explained very beautifully why from her medical background. But yeah, it was essentially like you might need a methylated form if you're from a South Asian population is what stood out to me because that was personally relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, that was amazing to me, thinking of all of the, obviously as yoga teachers, we're not prescribing folic acid, but I think it's important that we are connected with healthcare providers who know that difference and that we start to know the difference and call this out, that just our science in general, the medical field is racist.
Yes. Well, and I want to add to that too, that like Nam Chatterwin brought up this idea of like measurements, like for clothing. And he was saying, what are measurements based off of? And he was saying it was based off of white men going off to war. So it's like a military tool that was used to create like sizing. And now we use that same sizing today in our fashion industry.
That's fascinating because men going off to war would be obviously a younger population as well. I think they would be. And they're all male at that time when they were going off to war. It's amazing kind of how history has dictated what is happening throughout, like all kinds of things that touch yoga.
Yeah. And his conclusion to that, or what he said was, that when they research like how many people does this average sizing actually apply to, it's only 6% of the population.
Oh my gosh, 6% is crazy.
So then think about that in terms of movement too. Like, so when we learn like you have to do squats this way, like how many people does that actually apply to? And that's like the effective right way to do it. Right. And like for what purpose? Obviously we have to keep in mind like what's the function, what's the purpose we want them to achieve. But like, yeah, this is it. This is one way, or a yoga alignment. There's only one way to do down dog. Here's the right way. How many people does that apply to?
So one of my key takeaways now for like just listening to all of this with you is that we need to really question where this stuff is coming from. We need to be looking at the individuals in front of us. If we want to make safe spaces, we need to examine how we can become more of a safe person to marginalized people in general, like all people, to do the important work to know that everyone has their story going on underneath.
And can I add to that too?
Yes.
I just want to say that like we want all people to be welcome, but what I've realized is like we need to start to get really honest with ourselves about what we don't have the capacity to cater to yet. And that includes things like I don't speak sign language, right? So I can say all are welcome, but that it does not mean that people who need sign language are welcome, because I don't have that ability. Right. And I can start to expand on the places I don't have, but I need to get really real.
This is such a great awareness, because that's a great example. So a yoga teacher was recently talking to me, and I'm working on getting a guest on to talk about trans competency. And I'm just thinking now that this goes across the board. We may not have the understanding. Like sign language is really easy to pinpoint and say, well, of course, I can't lead a yoga class for people who need sign language. I'm not qualified to do that. But I think it gets fuzzy for other things.
Mm-hmm.
Like I am not the yoga teacher to lead a prenatal class for trans people. I don't think I have that specialty. I'd like to learn more. But I think what you're asking us to do is to really, am I right? That you're asking us
get
to
honest. Get honest. And then only from that place of honesty can we start to make any changes, right? Like if we're not honest about it, if we're like, oh, but look, I put, somebody of color on my website, all are welcome. Like that's not being honest. That's not saying like, hey, actually, I don't really understand XYZ population very well and the needs that they have and how to create a environment, a product, quote unquote, specifically for them, a service that meets them exactly where they need. I don't know that. But what you can do is when you acknowledge it, start to figure it out. Mm-hmm. But if you don't acknowledge it, you can't figure it out.
This is really good. It's conversations like the one that happened in your workshop. One thing that I loved is Megan Spears was on there, and she's a Black woman, and she was saying, I want to know how to bring more Black people to my yoga classes. So this is something that the yoga industry can take a look at, all of us as well. Like that moment right there was something that was so powerful for me to witness that she's working to do that as well, which says to me that yoga is not doing the yoga industry is not doing a very good job.
And she's saying that in part because, right, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I can extrapolate, and I know from my own experience that we learn yoga through the lens of whiteness primarily, mm-hmm. right? So the yoga we are learning is whitewashed in and of itself. So there needs to be an unlearning of that whitewashing in order to make that feel more appealing and more inclusive to other people who this doesn't apply to. And to be clear, right, like whiteness dictates that a specific group is at the top of the hierarchy, and that does not necessarily include queer, trans, non-binary folks. It doesn't include disabled folks or different ability folks. It does not necessarily include like a whole slew of people. It's not just that, it excludes people of color. Like whiteness serves to exclude anyone that doesn't fit the quote unquote ideal of whiteness, which is, a male cis hetero man.
Yeah. This is so important. I'm thinking if our yoga teachers want to dig in and do the work, they can definitely check out your podcast. Are there any, and we'll make sure to link to it in the show notes, are there any upcoming things that you would also ask them to check out, or books, or what if they want to dig in and go further?
There's so many resources, and I'll say that on the Yoga Zed website for episode 1, we have a ton of resources that we've listed out. We have like a resources page, and like for each episode, we've compiled like some of our resources that we've used to create the episodes, but also just to educate ourselves. So that's a great place to start. And I would just say, start talking to people in your community. That's the biggest one. Like there are people in your community who are keeping silent because they don't feel welcome to speak up. And so just starting to make that space available of like, I want to know what you think. Like, tell me what you really think.
Yeah.
Tell me what your experience is. Tell me what you're struggling with in this industry. Tell me where you don't feel acknowledged, heard, validated.
Well, and I really appreciate you sharing like your own personal story at the beginning of how that showed up for you. It seems crazy that you left this yoga university in India and then was told this didn't count. But I think when we hear those personal stories, it enables us to get a clear understanding without having lived through it.
Yeah. And I'll just say like the Yoga Teachers of Color Instagram handle is a great one to just start to follow, because with the list, we're trying to create like as much of a diverse representative group as possible. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing right now on our Instagram is highlighting a piece of each person's story and each person's like why or what they think is important right now to talk about. And so each story that we post, I find them truly powerful. So just that might be a place to start, and then you can start to figure out locally what's going on too.
Oh, this is great. I'll make sure that we link to that in our show notes as well. I had to look through my Instagram the other day and I was like, I need to look at my Instagram in terms of who I'm following and do a good examination of like, am I learning from this person? Is this adding to my education as a person? You know, is there a diversity even in my Instagram of like the voices that I'm listening to? So I think that's important as well. Yours would be a great one to then start to think, all right, I want to follow some other teachers. And also I want to say one other thing that I think we can be doing is, you know, looking at courses and trainings and books and podcasts with different voices. Like yours is a great place to start. And then from there, you can branch out and follow these different people and see what they're offering and take a yoga class from them or support them in so many ways. Yeah. Thanks for doing this important work, because as I said at the beginning, I love that you have this DNR email spot, but it's not, I'm sure there are tough days. So I really appreciate you for being brave and courageous in doing it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that. Yeah. Cause it is tough. It's not that easy, but you got to keep going when this is your path, you know, there's no choice. Mm-hmm. So thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Where can our yoga teachers find out more from you? What website should they go to first?
The best one is my Instagram handle at Yogawalla. It's YOGAWALLA. And then I have like my website links page in my bio. So it's like YogawallaNYC.com/links. And that has like the most up-to-date stuff that I'm working on.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Jesal, for all of your time, your wisdom, your knowledge. And Connected Yoga Teachers, I want to hear from you. Let's keep this conversation going. Can you think of some other examples of how racism might be showing up in your movement science or in our yoga and wellness spaces? There are a couple of ways to continue this conversation. One is in our show notes. If you go to theconnectedyogateacher.com/189, you can leave a comment at the bottom of the page. Another way is in our Facebook group. So if you're not already a member, come on over and join us. We have almost 10,000 yoga teachers from around the world in there. And that group is an amazing place to have supportive and engaging conversations. A few of you have been asking how you can work with me. And also, a few of you have been surprised to find out that I do one-on-one consultation calls. So I want to make sure that I let you know that if you go to theconnectedyogateacher.com, you can look under Work with Shannon and you can find out how to book a one-on-one consultation call. And that's if you want to get my eyes on your yoga business. I really love to help yoga teachers who are ready to specialize, stand out in the industry, really dig into who they are, and look at it as a business. Another way to work with me, it's coming up really soon, is to join Pelvic Health Professionals. So speaking of specializing, This is for you if you are a yoga teacher, movement educator, PT, midwife, doula, and you really specialize and want to learn more about pelvic health. So go to pelvichealthprofessionals.com and you can find the waitlist there. If you are on our waitlist, there are going to be some bonuses as well as an early invitation to join before the doors open to everyone else, which is in November. Before I close, I want to say a huge thank you to our team, and I also want to give you an update on what's happening with my herniated disc because some of you are regular listeners. So first of all, a huge thank you to our team, Suzanne, Crunch, Nick, and Sinead. Oh my gosh, you have done so much for the podcast and also our Facebook group this week and all of the weeks that you have been helping with the team. Thank you so much. Also, thank you, dear listener, for spending time today, for really investing time in this important topic. You're listening all the way to the end, and this is where I like to sometimes put a personal update. So I feel like in the last week and a half, I've had some big wins. I am able to walk around more. I'm able to get my own breakfast and my own tea, sometimes taking a break to lie down on the floor. One thing that has really been helping me is laying over, we have a large exercise ball, laying over that when I take my breaks during the day. So if you are like me and you sit at a desk a lot in the day, or you're sitting a lot or standing a lot, then you might consider, how can I find a different position? Maybe it is that you're listening to this podcast and you move around a little bit as you do that. I also started seeing another PT, a physiotherapist in my area, Deepa, and she's amazing. She specializes in neuro, and so she could really take a look at what is happening with my foot, my leg, because as we all know, a disc issue radiates in different ways throughout the body. And what I find so fascinating is she's starting to look at my thoracic area. So even though my disc issue is in the lumbar, she's starting to look at my thoracic and how I can gain some more mobility in that area. I've been posting updates on Instagram, and I was actually thinking one of the ways that I could remember some of the movements that my PT team and my health team is asking me to do is to post those on Instagram. So I've kind of made a mental note, and I'd love to share those. It'd be an easy way for me to remember what it is that I did that really helped me along. And what I'm figuring out is that every person and every disc issue is so unique. It's actually very fascinating to me to learn that what works for me is very different from what works for someone else. I know this, and this is why I love teaching one-on-one yoga, but it's like it brings it to a whole other level when you really experience something like an injury or pain in your own body. These are the things that really make us better teachers. So if you are out there feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm going through this thing or I'm dealing with this thing, and you're right in the thick of it, I hope that that gives you some comfort. It has given me comfort to think of this will help me to help yoga teachers and also yoga students. Alrighty, connected yoga teachers, I'm ready to sign off here. I want to know first, though, what you will be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and also your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up.